The veil trembled in his hands, light as breath, but his fingers felt heavy as iron. When he pulled it back, the world seemed to tilt, and the man who'd come to buy a wife for $5 fell to his knees in the dust. Her face was nothing like he'd imagined. So still, so hollowed by sorrow it looked carved from pale stone. Yet her eyes held something he didn't know how to name. Folks at the auction yard stared. Someone spat in the dirt. The auctioneer coughed into his fist, muttering for people to keep moving, that business was done here. But the man couldn't stand. He stayed kneeling there in the fading light, the cheap veil hanging from his hands, while the woman he'd just claimed stood like a ghost beside him. Let's go back to where it all started. The sun that morning had risen hard and bright over the Texas plains, throwing heat onto a world already baked dry. Dust rolled behind the wagons lined up along the town's one wide street. Cedar posts stood like tired sentries outside the saloon, the mercantile, the sheriff's office. A town still trying to prove it belonged. Jonas Cutter rode in slow, reins loose in his hand, hat pulled low to keep the glare out of his eyes. Folks glanced at him as he passed, some nodding, most just watching. He'd been here before, buying supplies for his lonely stretch of land near the Pecos, and nobody paid him much mind. He liked it that way, but today the air felt different. Word had spread, an auction was happening. A handful of women had been brought in by a trader, most from far-off settlements gone under. Some were mail-order brides who'd never found their husbands alive. Others had been left behind, abandoned or widowed, now reduced to something less than human in the eyes of men with money. Jonas hadn't come for that. He'd come for salt blocks, flour, rifle rounds. But as he tied up his horse and walked past the corral where they stood silent, heads bowed, something in him shifted. One woman stood apart, wrapped in a faded shawl, her posture straight despite the ropes loosely binding her wrists. She didn't meet anyone's gaze. Her hair fell in dark waves down her back, and her stillness was so complete it felt unnatural, as if she'd long ago stopped expecting anything from this world. A ranch hand near Jonas muttered, "They say she don't talk. Ain't said a word since they dragged her in from the border country. Must be Apache or Mexican or something. Hard to tell with the dirt on her." Jonas felt his throat tighten. He'd seen women like that before, caught between two worlds, claimed by neither, treated as less than livestock. He told himself to keep walking. But when the auctioneer barked out that she'd start at $5, because she wasn't worth the trouble, Jonas stopped. $5. It wasn't that he needed a wife. He'd buried enough family to know the silence of his ranch wasn't just emptiness anymore. It had become part of him. Still, his boots felt rooted to the ground as the crowd murmured and laughed. Nobody bid. The auctioneer shrugged, already turning to shove her toward the wagons that would take her farther west, where worse fates waited. "I'll take her," Jonas heard himself say. Heads turned. The laughter died. "You deaf?" the auctioneer asked, squinting at him. Jonas stepped forward, pulling coins from his pocket. $5. That's what you said. The coins hit the wooden table with a hard clink. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the rope was shoved into Jonas's hand, and the woman was his. She didn't flinch when he took it. Didn't look at him either. Just stood there, quiet as snowfall. Someone in the crowd called out, "Hope you like mules that don't bray, Cutter." A round of laughter followed, but Jonas ignored it. He led her away through the dust, past wagons and stairs, toward where his horse was tied. When they reached the shade of a cottonwood, he stopped. The rope hung slack between them. "You ain't property to me," he said softly, unsure if she'd understand. "You can ride with me to the ranch if that's what you want. You can walk away too. But I won't leave you to them." Still she didn't look at him. Slowly, Jonas reached for the veil that had been thrown over her head for the sale. His fingers hesitated at the edge of the cloth. When he pulled it away, he expected, he didn't know what. A stranger, maybe, someone broken beyond reach. But what he saw knocked the breath clean out of him. Her face bore old scars, pale against her sun-browned skin, as if someone had once tried to carve the life out of her and failed. But her eyes, dark, steady, endless as night, met his then. And Jonas Cutter, a man who hadn't bent his knees for anyone since his wife's funeral, sank to the ground without thinking. Behind them, townsfolk stared. A few whispered. Jonas didn't care, because for the first time in years, he felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing down on him, as if this moment, this woman, was about to change the course of his life forever. He didn't know yet how much blood, sorrow, and quiet mercy that $5 would cost him. But the sun was dipping lower, and the wind carried the faint sound of horses far out on the plains. Too many to be travelers, moving too fast to be friendly. Jonas didn't sleep that night. The woman sat by the small fire outside his cabin, her shawl pulled tight, the flickering light throwing her face into sharp planes and shadows. She hadn't spoken a word since he brought her here, hadn't even glanced at the cabin's single bed he'd left for her. Instead, she'd stayed outside, close to the fire as if it was the only thing she trusted. Jonas had offered her stew earlier. She'd eaten without meeting his eyes, the wooden spoon trembling slightly in her hand. After that, she'd retreated to her silence, and Jonas had retreated to his own thoughts. He lay awake on the cot near the cabin door, listening to the wind groaning against the eaves. Every so often, he'd catch himself staring through the doorway at her, trying to read what she wasn't saying. By morning, the rumors had already reached town. At the mercantile, two ranch hands were arguing over fence wire when Abel, the blacksmith, strode in shaking his head. "You hear about Cutter?" Abel said, voice carrying. The men looked up. "What about him?" "Paid $5 for that mute woman at the auction yesterday. Brought her back to that lonely ranch of his like she's some kind of prize." A bark of laughter followed. "Lord help him if she's Apache. Man'll wake up with his throat cut." Abel snorted. "Or worse, if the rangers hear he's harboring some Mexican runaway, they'll run him off his own land." A thin man near the barrels of coffee beans spoke up. "Maybe he don't care. Cutter's always been strange. Fights off rustlers like he's got nothing to lose. Maybe he's just tired of being alone." The room went quiet at that, because everyone knew Jonas Cutter wasn't just another lonely rancher. He was the man who'd buried a wife and infant son after a Comanche raid years ago. The man who rode into town twice a year, said little, and left. But pity only stretched so far out here. Folks didn't like when a man crossed invisible lines about race, tribe, and ownership. By sundown, 3 riders appeared at Jonas's gate. They didn't dismount, didn't knock, just waited, hats low, rifles resting against their saddles. Jonas stepped out, his rifle in the crook of his arm. "Evenin', Cutter," one of them called. It was Eli Warren, a wiry man with a snake oil grin and a reputation for starting fights he didn't finish. "Evenin'," Jonas said flatly. "Heard you picked up something at the auction yesterday. Thought we'd pay a visit. Make sure you ain't bringin' trouble this way." Behind him, the woman appeared in the cabin doorway, her shawl still around her shoulders, her eyes unreadable. Eli leaned forward in his saddle, spit dark tobacco juice into the dirt. "You know how it looks. Fella brings home a wild one. Folks get nervous." "She ain't wild," Jonas said. Eli smirked. "Ain't she?" The other 2 men chuckled under their breath. Jonas shifted his rifle just enough for them to notice. "She's not your concern." The laughter died. Eli's grin faltered. "Maybe, or maybe she's everyone's concern. Folks don't like what they don't understand. They see scars on her face, no words in her mouth, and they start thinking the worst." Jonas's jaw tightened. He'd heard it before, how people needed someone to blame for every fear they carried. "I'll handle my own business," Jonas said. Eli studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in the saddle. "Reckon you will. But don't say we didn't warn you when trouble rides in." The 3 men turned their horses and rode off slow, dust curling behind them. Jonas stood there long after they were gone, rifle still in his hand. When he finally looked back at her, she was watching him. Not blankly this time, but with something sharp in her gaze. For a moment, Jonas wondered if she understood more than she let on. That night, as the wind picked up and coyotes howled out on the flats, Jonas sat on the porch sharpening his knife. He couldn't shake the feeling that trouble wasn't just coming. It was already on its way. And when the woman stepped outside and placed her palm flat against the porch rail, just inches from where his hand rested, he realized she was waiting too. Not for rescue, but for whatever reckoning they both knew was coming. The next day broke under a blood-orange sky, the kind that promised heat by noon and storms by night. Jonas rose early, feeding the horse and checking the small corral while the woman, still silent, stood by the porch, shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. She watched him work, her expression unreadable as always, but her eyes seemed to follow every motion. When he glanced her way, she didn't look down this time. By mid-morning, Jonas was riding fence along the south pasture when he spotted them. Thin columns of dust out on the horizon, moving in a way that made his stomach knot. They weren't just travelers. They were scouts, and they were too far out to be friendly neighbors. Jonas turned his horse back toward the cabin. When he arrived, she was still on the porch. But she'd seen the dust too. Her eyes were locked on the horizon, and for the first time, he saw something flicker across her face. Not fear, recognition. Jonas tied off his horse, moving quick. He pulled the old Henry rifle from above the hearth inside, along with a half-empty box of cartridges. "Company's coming," he muttered, though he didn't expect her to answer. But she stepped forward suddenly, her hand brushing his sleeve, stopping him in his tracks. Slowly, she pointed toward the east ridge. Jonas hesitated. The east ridge was hidden by scrub and boulders, perfect for an ambush. "You know them," he said quietly. Her hand lowered, fingers curling at her side. Jonas felt the weight of the moment pressing down. He could stay and defend the cabin. He could try to run, though running across open prairie was suicide. Or he could trust her. The distant hoofbeats grew louder, the rhythm carrying across the dry ground. Jonas stepped outside, rifle in hand. Dust rose like a wall as riders came into view. 6 of them, dark against the bright sky, rifles slung across their saddles. The lead rider, Eli Warren, reined in at the gate. "Cutter," he called, voice sharp. "They're coming for her." Couple folks from town saw a war party 5 miles out. Maybe Apache, maybe Mexican raiders. Don't matter which, they're heading straight here. Jonas didn't answer. "You hand her over," Eli said, "or we're all dead men when they get here." Jonas's grip tightened on the rifle. Eli spat into the dirt. "Ain't worth it, Cutter. She ain't yours. Never was. $5 don't buy you nothin' but trouble." The woman stood just behind Jonas now, her shawl fluttering in the dry wind. Eli's eyes flicked to her. "Hell, maybe she brought him here herself. You think about that?" Jonas looked at her then, really looked. Her chin was lifted slightly, her eyes steady. Not pleading, not afraid, just waiting. The hoofbeats were closer now. The riders in the distance were no longer a smudge. They were coming fast, dust boiling around them. Eli leaned forward in his saddle. "Decide, Cutter. Hand her over, or stand in front of her when they come." Jonas lowered the rifle slightly, his pulse hammering in his ears. And for the first time since he'd taken her from that auction yard, he spoke the truth out loud, to himself as much as to Eli. "She's not leaving this land unless she chooses to walk." Eli cursed under his breath. "Then you're a damn fool." The approaching riders fanned out across the flats, sunlight flashing off their rifles. The sound of their horses filled the air like thunder. Jonas stepped down from the porch, standing in the dust with the rifle resting easy in his hands, the woman just behind him. The line between living and dying felt razor-thin now. And as the riders closed in, Jonas realized there was no turning back. The war party slowed as they neared the ranch, fanning out in a crescent. Dust drifted in the air, glowing gold in the sinking sun. The horses stamped and snorted, restless. Jonas stood still, rifle lowered but ready, his boots planted in the dirt. Eli Warren and his men had pulled back toward the barn, not eager to be the first target if leads started flying. The riders reined in just out of range, their faces hidden beneath wide hats and scarves. The leader, a tall man with a scar cutting down the side of his jaw, swung down from his saddle and stepped forward slowly, one hand raised in a gesture that wasn't quite peace, wasn't quite threat. Jonas didn't move. Behind him, the woman stepped off the porch. She moved past Jonas, past the barrel of his rifle, until she stood halfway between him and the stranger. The shawl slipped from her shoulders, falling to the dust. The scarred man stopped dead. He said something in a language Jonas didn't understand, harsh consonants softening into a sound that carried weight. And for the first time since Jonas had seen her, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost hoarse from years of silence, but steady. She answered in the same tongue, a few simple words that made the scarred man flinch as if struck. He took a step closer, eyes never leaving hers. Then he looked at Jonas, studying him as if trying to read the truth behind his stillness. The woman spoke again, longer this time. Her voice cracked halfway through, but she kept going, and by the end, there was no mistaking the tears standing in her eyes. The scarred man dropped to one knee in the dust. The riders behind him shifted uneasily. One of them dismounted too, bowing his head slightly. Jonas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't begging. It wasn't surrender. It was claiming something, claiming him, the land, the choice that had been taken from her long ago. When she finally turned toward Jonas, her lips trembled, but her gaze was firm. "I have a name," she whispered in halting English, as if dragging the words out of a long-buried part of herself. Jonas lowered the rifle, his chest tight. "What is it?" he asked softly. For a moment, she just looked at him, her eyes shining in the low sun. "Isolde," she said, the syllables foreign on her tongue but heavy with meaning. The scarred man bowed his head deeper, speaking a single word, one that sounded like both grief and release. Jonas didn't know why, but his throat burned as if he'd swallowed fire. The moment hung there, brittle as glass, as if one wrong move would shatter it all. Then, slowly, the scarred man stood. He glanced at Isolde, then at Jonas, and gave a single sharp nod. Whatever blood had been promised, whatever vengeance had carried them here, it was over. The riders turned their horses. One by one, they mounted up and wheeled away into the dying light. Eli Warren, standing near the barn, let out a low breath. What in God's name just happened? Jonas didn't answer, because Isolde was still looking at him, not as the man who bought her for $5, but as the man who'd stood between her and the world. And for the first time, Jonas understood that she hadn't chosen silence. It had been forced on her. Until now,